So, Matt, the topic I really want to focus on today is around the corporate structure, moving away from a partnership model. So, you've done that. Could you talk to me a little bit about your initiation of that change from a partnership to a corporate model?
Definitely, Mark. So started back in 2018. We set a 5-year strategic goal as a stakeholder group. And that goal at the time was, we've been at 20 million for several years, kind of bouncing 20, 25 within that range. And we identified that we wanted to try to break into the top 100. So we put that plan into place. And as part of that plan, we brought a CEO, which was one of our practice line shareholders, into the CEO role. And at that time, we did have a firm administrator kind of playing operations and finance. We had an HR director, but really not anyone in kind of that chief C-suite capacity outside of the CEO. So as we continue to grow through that 5-year trajectory, and we actually hit our goal of meeting the top 100, which was very exciting. Throughout that 5-year span, as the responsibilities and needs of the firm grew, we identified that we needed to start kind of moving C-suite individuals into the fold. So we went from HR director to CPO. Marketing was something that we always looked at that was just not as much importance as we should have placed on it. So we brought in a CMO, a COO, and a chief information and technology officer. So we ended up building out that C-suite as we started to approach that $60 million mark. And we're excited to take it beyond now from aspirational goal of 60 to 100 in the next 3 years.
It's a fantastic story and what you've achieved during that time to establish YHB in the rankings and moving through the gears. What were some of the, were there some challenges that you were experiencing that really caused you to make that move? Were there some challenges you were seeing in the partnership model that made that feel a compelling approach?
Yeah, I think, Mark, what it boiled down to is, the way that we were running it as a $20 million firm was not wrong. It worked as the $20 million firm. And at that mark, we were committee driven. So shareholders were essentially taken away from client service. Principals were taken away from client service, and they were put into committees. So we had an HR committee, a financial oversight committee, a marketing committee. So we were committee driven. And as we continued to grow, part of hitting those growth goals is we got to stay focused on the market. We got to stay focused on client service. And we just started to realize that there are other folks out there, again, kind of the level of the C-suite member that we need to rely on to run HR, to run marketing, to run operations, to run finance, to allow highest and best use approach for the principals to focus on client service, growth of the firm, growth of the business lines, and that in a committee-driven environment, it created a lot of distraction in that we were being run by consensus. And I think when you tried to run by consensus of a broad group, especially as that group grew, right, from 20 principals to 25 principals to 30 principals, it just became almost paralyzing to push needed decisions through in a timely manner. So as part of that process, we also expanded the board to answer that concern of moving away from the committee structure to more of an advisory council structure. We also expanded the board from 3 principals to 5 to give a broader representation of the growing firm and of the growing constituent group.
So it's interesting what you shared there, because I think a lot of people, as they're weighing up the corporate model versus the partnership model, will probably default to the decision-making process. And I completely agree with that. Often you find it's indecision by committee because there's no way of all getting consensus other than we all agree that we don't agree on this. And so therefore, let's not do anything, which, when we talk about technology or change, that can be a real problem in terms of what maintains the status quo almost as a byproduct of being unable to make a clear decision. But what you then shared before that was really interesting to me around, effectively, you were viewing this as a way of your people focusing on what they were really good at, and partners are really good at client service. That's typically what's got them into the partner seat in the first place. You've got to be able to handle clients, go and win new clients, look after clients to be able to get to the partner seat. but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're a marketing expert or you're a HR expert. And so dragging those partners into things that weren't necessarily their sweet spot, weren't necessarily their highest and best use of time, you've seen that as being one of the key drivers for this.
Definitely one of the key drivers, Mark. And the thing is, YTB doesn't have it all right? And I think that if you're in a state of mind where you think you're doing everything exactly right, then you're probably missing something big. So it's a constant evolution. And the reason I say that in response to that question, Mark, is, you brought up the highest and best use term, which is something that in our reset of our strategic plan, which we just did this past August, we are moving very rapidly into the concept of highest and best use. And not that every partner's focus needs to be client service. Some need to be BD, growth, and trying to get away as we continue to evolve in this structure and this mindset of highest and best use. Again, governance, their highest and best use is governance of management in the firm. The line partners or the client-facing principals, their highest and best use is either growing and developing the business, the client service, the leadership of the teams, not necessarily the oversight in management of the entity. And not to say that they of course they have a vested interest, right? They're shareholders. They have a very strong vested interest in the outcome of the firm. But you can't have everyone trying to run the firm, because to your point, it's paralyzing. It's indecision. And I can't remember the term that you actually just utilized, Mark, but it was
indecision by committee.
Indecision by committee. Thank you. Yes, that stuck with me. Indecision by committee. So excited as we continue to move away from that and evolve and truly focus on highest and best use. I think that the opportunities that unleashes are going to be really fun to watch and for the firm to experience in the years to come.
I would suggest that a number of management partners who might be thinking about making the move from a partnership model to a corporate structure will first and foremost be nervous about what you've just touched on there around the partner group, the shareholders, the key stakeholders that we currently have all sat around the boardroom table whenever we need to make a decision. How are they going to feel about relinquishing some of that control and some of that insight that they currently have, which they will naturally lose as part of this? What would you maybe suggest to some of those managing partners in terms of ways that you've handled that as part of your transition? Any things that worked really well for you? Any things that you would do differently if you were going to do it again?
It's a really good question, and I have to admit it's kind of interesting. I wish my CEO was sitting here right beside me as well. But I think it boils down to communication, right? And I think what we have found is that our level of communication and depth of communication has improved exponentially. And when I think back to kind of 2018, when we set the initial strategic plan to get in the top 100, we executed that. Now we just had a strategic reset, and we want to try to get to that 100 million mark and beyond. It's the communication aspect, Mark, because rightfully so, when you start to move in that direction of kind of the corporate governance versus the partnership model, these are principals that have worked hard their careers to get into the roles that they are, and the financial outcomes of the firms are truly directly impact them, no different than it impacts the employees in the broader base as well. But they feel that you're stripping something away from them, when in fact the hope and the strategy behind it is to give them more, right? In terms of financial performance, benefit opportunities to the team, leadership opportunities to the team, not to actually strip away something. So over communicating, I think, is key. And like any organization, you're going to have missteps along the way in the communication. But we've implemented things, Mark, like monthly line principal meetings. So I hold a monthly assurance principal meeting. There's a monthly tax principal meeting. The CAS group gets together. I, on the assurance side at least, have implemented a quarterly department meeting. So actually have a live 1 hour
like
Zoom
all
meeting,
hands effect.
an all hands meeting, and starting to figure out ways not only to tap the staff into some of the communication, right? I mean, they want that same level of communication as well as they start to see these changes within the firm. And then a really neat thing that our CEO, Tom Milburn, just put into place was a weekly podcast. So to answer that need for the constant feedback of, well, if I'm not going to be involved in the decision-making process, then I at least want to know what's going on within my firm.
Yeah.
And making sure that we're bridging that gap, but while also reinforcing that you can't be involved in every decision. And that doesn't mean that your insights don't matter. It's just we will not move if we have to run by consensus. But with the big decisions, you will be brought in. You do have a vote in the direction of this firm. So I think clearly defining and kind of going back to that partnership agreement, because it's not that the partnership agreement isn't good, but revisiting it to make sure that as you move into this structure of corporate governance, that you have truly clearly defined and that there is buy-in in the decision points that require consensus and vote versus the decision points that you're going to trust your elected board, your appointed leads, and your high-powered C-suite to move on.
So it feels like effectively, I would agree that if you as a leader don't think that you're over communicating, you're not communicating enough. That's one of the lessons I've learned over the years as well. If I'm not sick of saying the same thing, then I haven't said it enough at this point. But I think the bit you touched on there was almost as you transition or look to transition, looking at that partnership agreement, identifying from that what is going to change, but equally what is not going to change.
Yeah.
I think is a tip that people could definitely take away from this. But then translating that into very clear roles and responsibilities for, yes, we are going to now have a C-suite, and these are going to be the roles, and these are what those people are accountable for and responsible for, and you can stop thinking about those things now as a client-facing partner because they've got that. We now want you to spend that 10% extra time that we've freed up from running the business to actually now go and make all of us more money out of this.
Yeah,
so
correct. And part of it too is the balance too, right? Because with the industry in the state it's in right now, I mean, we're all running hard. We're all charging forward. And some of that time back too is, the word trust is tough, right? To go to a group and say, well, you have to trust that the board, management, we got it under control and we're going to take care of the house. But again, as you're in that transition period, that trust concept, I think, is one of the biggest hurdles. But not only the ability for you to focus back on your highest and best use, but to be honest, Mark, some of it also is to be able to go home and unplug.
Yeah.
Right? To not feel that you have to be burdened and up all night worried about firm direction or some of these decisions. And I think in the transition period, you probably lose less sleep knowing that that's been taken away from your purview. But I hope that in the long run, we start to see that as we kind of continue to hit our stride and we continue to transform and evolve, that all of us look back and say that, and I'm confident that we will look back and say that we made the right moves and everyone is focused and happier on what they do day to day.
It's interesting. You're almost saying that the role of a partner in a partnership model, there's two roles. There's the client-facing role, and then there's every one of those partners has some level of running the business.
Yes. Yeah.
And to create a clear delineation between that, I think gives you focus. And I'm a huge advocate of clarity in roles, focus, discipline. We use traction in our business as a way of the entrepreneurial operating system, as a way of clearly defining the seats in the business, the accountabilities, the responsibilities. And that's very difficult when you've got a lot of people who are all effectively performing a little bit of a role. We've got 20 partners who are all contributing towards the oversight and management of the business. Well, a C-suite gives you defined people who have that responsibility.
Exactly.
And that doesn't necessarily mean that the partner role is less important. I think it's potentially even more important in this scenario.
And Mark, to that point, it's interesting as we moved into this model and we got our C-suite in place, we got the practice leads in place. We actually sat together in an offsite meeting and we started kind of laying out what are the priorities. And we also took a moment to kind of bring out the whiteboard and to actually draw the org chart. And it was very interesting, the evolution of that process of drawing the org chart is that I think it's important to make sure that the principals that maybe aren't involved in the practice lead role, the board, or in management, as you move into this model, still understand that as a practice lead, I still understand and acknowledge that at the end of the day, the principal group, the shareholders, are at the top of the org chart, right? And I think to make sure that they understand and know that you acknowledge that is, it's not that we're saying you're down below now. They're still the stakeholders of the organization. But in order to run efficiently, make decisions, and execute on things that hopefully build firm value, which at the end of the day is all what we're wanting to do, is build firm value. Otherwise, what are we in this for? It's I'm rambling a bit, but the concept of building firm value and the acknowledgement and understanding that at the end of the day, we're still doing this for the shareholders that are at the top of the org chart, that it's not board, CEO, PLs, and shareholders are down here. They're still back at the top. But it's interesting, right? Because you get in this like, well, you can start drawing arrows, right? Well, we're doing this to then push it down to them, but then you still move them back to the top. So yeah,
I like that though, because acknowledging that through the organization chart or the accountability chart, like you almost clearly define that the partners are effectively sitting in two seats. You've got the partner group at the very top, the shareholders.
Yep.
You've then got your board that are your appointed members of that stakeholder group for the corporate governance side. Then you've got your CEO, then you've got your C-suite, and then you've got the client-facing partners. Now, if that piece wasn't acknowledged at the top of the org chart, I think those partners might feel like, okay, so I've been pushed down a couple of rungs.
Correct.
Actually, by saying, well, no, let's be clear, you're doing two roles. When we are forming this group to do the things that this group's been defined to do, you are at the top of the org chart.
100%.
You are now need to switch into that mode of you are a business owner and this is what you need to be involved in. But when you're not in that mode day to day, you're in this role, and this role requires you to do this, this, and this. And I think that I've not really thought about that before, but even just that subtlety of presentation could really help the partner group understand, oh, right, I'm not being demoted through this. I'm actually is clarifying what I need to do and which mode I need to be in some of the time.
Correct. And it's I would encourage anyone considering this to just get out the whiteboard and actually draw that out, because I think that helps in the clarification and communication of this, is that as a practice lead, I'm still accountable to my shareholders, right? Period. I am not over them. Quite frankly, they're above me. That's who I am. That's who we are working as a management team, as a governance group, to provide value to at the end of the day. And I love the way that you put it, Mark, is that it could be perceived as a demotion, but it's not. It's not. It's the operating org chart, but then when it comes to the decision making and the value org chart, they're still back at the top. So, the big decision making. Again, I got to be careful there.
Yeah.
Not every decision, but the big decisions, they're back at the top.
And having that clear chart of what is the big decisions and what are the day-to-day decisions, I think that's really important. I've seen that one of the things that's caused a lot of firms to move to the corporate model has been taking on private equity investment. YHB, that wasn't the driver for you. You are independent. What I've heard from you, though, was that the story was around growth. And I would say that has some clear alignment to what a lot of private equity-backed firms are looking to achieve through merger and acquisition and organic growth. So what I'd be interested in getting your take on is the corporate model really one that supports firms with strong growth ambitions? Or is this a case of trying to find the right size of firm? What do you think is the right place to consider making this move?
It's a good question, Mark. I think growth is a key driver, because at the end of the day, when you start moving into a model where you're taking someone and putting them in a CEO role, potentially with no client-facing business, as a practice lead, my client-facing responsibility, my practice leads is decreased. And then you start to look at the impact of bringing in C-suite level individuals. I do think there's a certain line in terms of revenue, profitability, where it makes sense and where it doesn't. So I think that's why 20 million was kind of the kicking point for us, the kickoff point for us, where we realized that as we started to go from 20 to 30 to 40, we started to engage in more merger and acquisition activity. During the pandemic, we actually executed 3 or 4 acquisitions, which was fascinating, right? A lot of firms were kind of pulling back. We charged forward, but you start to realize the cost of the switch to a corporate governance structure. And I do think there's a certain line that you have to be at to where it starts to make sense. But I don't want to focus on my term that I just used of the cost of corporate governance structure, because I think that the benefit of the structure, if you are a firm with growth aspirations for whatever reason, that there is a significant benefit again to that. That I want to be careful of saying the cost of corporate structure. There's a benefit of corporate structure,
investment,
but it comes with an investment. Very, very good transition there. It's an investment that you're making, not a cost. So I do think that it's growth driven, but I don't think that it's private equity driven. I do think private equity highlighted that if they're willing to invest in our industry in the way that they are, and they're structuring themselves the way that they are to succeed in this industry, it does merit you to take a step back and say, well, if I'm not modeling the way that they're approaching this industry, am I missing something within my firm or within my approach? So I do think that private equity gives us really neat insights, but I don't think that we have to tag it as being something that private equity is forcing us to do.
There's a lot for independent firms to learn from how private equity
100%.
is approaching the accounting profession. And like you said, private equity people are very smart and they've made a lot of money for a lot of good reasons.
Yep.
If you can take some of those playbooks and implement them yourselves without needing to take on private equity, and where those two aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, you can look at this and go, okay, yeah, that's an investment that they're making in their firms that they've invested in.
Highlighted the need for reinvestment in your firm.
Exactly.
It has highlighted the need because, again, if they're willing to invest in us and we're not investing in us, there's a disconnect. You got to bridge that.
And there's some real macro aspects here that I think really drive firms to consider or reconsider whether the partnership model is the right model for the pace of change that's happening in the market, the level of investment that's needed in the business. That's not just potentially the roles and the seniority of people, but or specialist skills like a chief marketing officer is going to be a very different kind of person than would have naturally come through the firm.
And then as you trickle down from there, Mark, the reinvestments in tech, the reinvestments in people, right? Because we're a people business. And I always say that, like, if we don't have the people and the people aren't engaged and the people aren't excited, then we're not going to have clients. The client service is going to slack.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a reinvestment, to your point, into the C-suite and the corporate governance structure, but then that investment trickles down into the tech space, the people space, the marketing and BD space. Large reinvestment, yes, or investment.
And that ability to just clear the way and make those decisions. And you touched on M&A there, and that you've been very active in that particular space. Have you found the corporate model to contribute to M&A specifically? I know a lot of firms are looking to grow through M&A, but I think for me, one of the secrets to that success is those onboarding and integration of those firms, not just the technology side, but then culture, etc. How have you found the corporate structure to help you in that particular area?
Yeah, good question, Mark. So on the M&A space, I think as we were growing and kind of building out our corporate governance model, again, we were somewhat committee driven, right? So an acquisition committee. But as you start to look at these acquisitions and the due diligence, we've all worked with clients, right, that are going through M&A, and we know how extensive and exhaustive in the strain on resources that due diligence can create for our clients. Well, it's no different than when we're looking at M&A. So if we're relying on an acquisition committee to assist in due diligence, again, the pull away from the largest value driver, at least, which is allowing them to focus on highest and best use, which is leadership of their teams, growth and development of their client base, client service, then we're sacrificing one area of great value add to the firm to come over here and shift over towards the M&A initiative. So where we've seen the benefit, again, of starting to bring in the CPO, the CFO, the COO, the CMO, the CITO, is as we continue to execute on an M&A strategy, the insights and the ability to vet a lot of these opportunities, and then you bring the ones that are worth further discussion to the broader group in a manner that the due diligence has been done, the due diligence has been vetted, and you're bringing great opportunities to the table, not taking them away, meaning the practicing shareholders, the client-facing shareholders, away from what their highest and best use is to do the M&A. So definitely a benefit, Mark. The integration
Yeah.
Again, CPO side, the integration piece from the people aspect, huge. And we've had missteps, right? I think all firms that are in that M&A realm, you're going to learn every single one. But if you're not learning from them and adapting and changing for the next, then I think that's the issue.
So if I was to recap some of the key takeaways for me from this conversation, I would say that first and foremost, one of the key drivers to think about maybe the advantages of a corporate model would be your strategy and your growth ambitions in particular. Are you at the size and have you got the ambition that would warrant my second key takeaway, which would be the investment that you would need to view this as,
The investment benefit approach.
Exactly. Yeah. So you're going to need to invest in this particular area to be able to support that. The key return from that would be back to the first point, which is growth, right? If this is going to be an investment that unlocks growth, then it will pay off significantly. But this might be viewed very differently if it's an investment to maintain status quo.
Correct.
Then the other key takeaway for me was around how we need to really think about presenting that in terms of an org chart or in terms of the way that we really look at the partnership agreements, that we look at the roles and responsibilities, we define the seats, and we make it clear that partners aren't being demoted through this change. They're being presented with a 2-seat role. There's the day job, the client serving aspects that they are excellent at. And there's a modified governance and oversight of the business that takes them to a more higher level, more strategic involvement and a less tactical day-to-day operational management of the business.
Perfectly put, Mark.
And I think the final point would be then to make sure that the communication from there is really strong in terms of how it's communicated to that partner group, but also how it changes maybe the way that you communicate to the broader business. And I really like the quarterly all hands that you're doing with the whole business, the regular touch points you've established with that partner group to make sure, if anything, they feel like they're getting more out of this model rather than they're getting less. So those would be probably my 4 key takeaways. But did I miss anything or anything that you wanted to emphasize as we close out?
I think you did a great job of summarizing kind of the conversation here, Mark. And again, just real emphasis on that 4th point, adjusted communication. And that's an area that we're constantly evolving, constantly improving. And I think that is key to the success of a transition from a partnership model to a corporate governance model, is that over communication. Because if one thing rings true, it's that no matter how much you communicate, it's never enough, right? You're not going to satisfy the needs of all your stakeholders, but you have to get the majority to the point where they are satisfied with the level of communication, but also understand that you're never going to satisfy everyone, and that's honestly tough as you move into CEO, practice lead, board role. But just making sure that communication is clear, concise, and that you articulate it well and regularly.
I would close by saying communication, for me, you're going to get tired about saying the same thing over and over. So think about different channels that you can use, different formats that you can use, Teams versus email versus in-person, video, podcasts, and think about different angles that you can take on the same message. And like thinking about how can we, what is in it for me, the person reading this? How can I spin this in different ways? But Matt, I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's such a hot topic for many accounting firms. And I think that this has been super insightful for firms to start to really understand this a little bit more and think about, is this something that they want to take further forward, or is it something that they're comfortable with the way that they're currently running their business? But I really appreciate your insights and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate you.